of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end. Perhaps as soon as I say that, you think, oh, that doesn't sound very Christmassy, talking about politics, talking about a king, somebody who's almost a world dictator by the sound of it. Well, you might think it doesn't sound Christmassy, and certainly at Christmas we tend to think about lots of other things as well. But in fact, it's been in all of our readings, and it's really in all of the Christmas readings you can imagine. The idea that this baby who's born is this king. This king promised as far back as Genesis 49, this king promised and foreshadowed through all of the Old Testament, promised again here in Isaiah 9. And then again, finally, when the angel comes to Mary, he says, he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. So it is Christmassy. Well, perhaps you think, okay, well, I can see that it's Christmassy, but if I'm honest, it doesn't sound great. We don't like talking about empire. We're trying to get past our colonial past. Why are we talking about somebody whose empire, his rule is increasing? Or you think, I don't like big government. I'm a small government person. I want fewer regulations, fewer red tape. The idea that somebody's government would increase is something I don't want. Well, I'll say more about that. But perhaps we can see that it might be Christmassy. We can see that it could be a good thing. But we think, actually, it just doesn't sound possible. We can barely imagine something which just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and better and better and better. Everything we've ever known has a kind of growth, peak, decline, shape. What if there's something that isn't like that? Something that just keeps getting bigger and better and bigger and better forever. It's actually pretty hard for us to imagine that. Blows our minds. What if it were possible? What if it were true? Well, I want to say two things about that little verse, Isaiah chapter 9, verse 7, this evening. One is to say that it speaks of a global increase across the whole earth. This is something that was promised long ago. The reason I put in the service sheet the dates that these things were written is that they're very implausible for us to imagine. Can you imagine that 1700 years before something happened, that someone wrote down that exactly it would? Jesus, who was well known to be of the family of David, King David, was also of the tribe of Judah, the same Judah of whom Mo just read, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Or, okay, 1700 years, that's a decent, maybe a lucky guess. Well, another 1,000 years later, in 700 BC, Isaiah said this, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. Later on, he will reign on the throne of David and over his kingdom. Well, fast forward another 700 years to the actual events of the Christmas story, and as mad as it sounds, those things that were promised and written down hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years before, are actually coming to pass. To him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Perhaps we thought in the Christmas story, what's that weird bit with the wise men? Why do they come from so far? What's the point of that? Well, it's trying to say that this is real. That if some people are coming from the east, from some country we don't know where it was, well, so people will come from every country to bow at the feet of this little one, this baby, this obscure little child. Historians debate what the greatest empire ever was. The British Empire was the most extensive. The sun never set on it in terms of land that it included at one time. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan was the largest empire that was in one block, kind of continuous land mass. The Persian Empire, several years before Christ, 100 years before Christ, was the greatest percentage of people. About 48% of all the people alive at that time were in the Persian Empire. And the Roman Empire, arguably, was the longest and the most influential. But they peaked and they're gone. Unless you still think we live in the Roman Empire today. If that's you, come and talk to me afterwards. We certainly don't live in the Mongol Empire. They're gone. They ended. Not so with the kingdom of Jesus Christ. In 1900, so only 125 years ago, across the whole continent of Africa, there were 8 million Christians. Today, there are 650 million. 500 AD, say. There were only a handful of Christians at that time, driven back into the mountains of their own land. How many millions have there been in the 1500 years since? The Bible has been translated, at least in part, into 3,600 languages. There is no manifesto, no book, nothing that's been translated into so many languages, has reached so many peoples, nowhere even close. What about our dating system? Today is coming towards the end of the shortest day of 2025. We call it 2025 because, whether entirely accurately or not, it's 2025 years since these events, since Jesus was born. The Romans dated their years from the founding of Rome, the legendary founding of Rome by Romulus and Remus in 753 BC. And so it was such and such years ab urbe condita from the founding of the city. The French, after the French Revolution, tried to introduce a whole new calendar system. 12 years later, it was rolled back. And yet here we are, 2025 years after. And no matter how people may try and change BC to BCE or AD to CE, they're still talking about the same time. If it is a common era, what is it that is common to all nations in it? It is that Jesus was born. And yet, if he's such a great king, what is with the incredibly obscure start to his life? His obscure birth in a stable because there wasn't any room in the inn. What is with his life being misunderstood and rejected as he taught in the highways and byways and fields and cities of Judea? What is it with his shameful death on a cross? And yes, the claims later that he'd risen from the dead, but even that was brutally suppressed. The apostles, those whom he appointed to say they'd seen him risen from the dead, almost all of them were martyred for it. And yet it can't be stopped. This kingdom, which is not a political kingdom like the other kingdoms, cannot be stopped. Here we are, 2025 years and counting from it, and it's still growing. Let me just kind of throw out a couple of challenges, or one of them a challenge and one of a comfort from that. If this was a myth, it's a pretty impressive myth. A myth that was foretold 1,700 years before, and then 700 years before, and plenty of other times in between, that focused on one person being born from one tribe, and in fact from one family, and then living a life of obscurity and dying a death of shame, and then coming back. It should have faded. How do you account for the expansion in spite of the ferocity of its opponents, in spite of the failures of its proponents? Very often Christians have been the worst testimony to Christ, and yet it can't be stopped. How can that be? Unless there's something to it. Or what about the comfort? Even as we look at things in our own nation or things around the world, we feel that things are not going well. Perhaps you're a Christian, or you think, sort of on the edge of being a Christian, and you look at how small and how weak and how lacking in influence the Christian church is. But when in doubt, zoom out. When in doubt, zoom out to see this kingdom which is increasing and increasing and increasing. And what makes it increase? Well, the last line that Patrick read from Isaiah is this: the zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. It's God who's doing this. If he's got a plan, however strange the twists and turns of it might be, it cannot be stopped. So that's the first thing. Of the increase of his government of peace, there will be no end. It's a global increase, and it is increasing, and it has increased, and it will continue to increase. Here's the second thing. A personal increase of the rule, the kingship of Jesus. So far, we've spoken about the increase of numbers, the geography of the world, spreading across, lasting and outlasting any human empire. But this increase of his government and of peace is also an increase in the geography of each of our lives, in the geography of our souls, working its way through all of our heart and mind, intellect and will, our desires, our passions. Jesus claims a total jurisdiction over every part of every person's life. Now, if you're someone who's here who wouldn't say they're a Christian, come along with a friend. First, I'm extremely glad you're here, and you're so welcome. Please do stay around. There's many things to enjoy, to eat and drink afterwards. You might not realize this, but your Christian friends aspire to this. They aspire that Jesus should be the ruler of every part of their lives. There are some things in that you probably have seen in them that you find commendable. There might be some things in that you would find deplorable. But in a strange way, they don't care. Because Jesus is their king, their governor, inside and out. I should say then that Christians are not Christians because they're nice people, upstanding people. They've got everything together, and that's why they look down on other people. I'm afraid I'm very sorry if it comes across that way. In fact, we're the first to admit, or should be the first to admit, that we're not. We are people who are sinners, whose only hope is in a God who would actually dare to forgive us, who would actually want to welcome us, in spite of everything we've done, in spite of all we continue to do. Our only hope is this Jesus. The reason he came, not just as a Alexander the Great style ruler who would just blitz his way across the Middle East and rule everything, but instead as a baby, and then as a man, and then as one who hung on a cross, was not only to be a king, but to be a rescuer. And Jesus Christ is a wise and benevolent king. I was discovering this week that a huge amount of new legislation, new law is added to our country's statute books every year. So on average, there's a new statute every 10 days. Some of them are like 1 page long. Some of them are hundreds of pages long. Even more disturbingly, there's on average of 10 statutory instruments, which are kind of like secondary legislation, every single day. Some of them are page long, some of them are hundreds of pages long. Thousands and thousands of pages are added to our country's laws every year. Well, for Jesus' citizens, for the sinners he's won forgiveness for, all that he says, all of his rule could be put on a postcard. It really reduces to 10 commandments and even to 2, to love your neighbor and to love the Lord. What a good ruler he is, and what peace he brings, not only in the world, but to us. There is so much, not only in the big picture of the things you read about in the news, but even in your own life, that you can't control. Your health, your family, your work situation. So much we can't even control that we know we should be able to control. Temper, our appetites. And Jesus says that his government and of peace, the increase of his government and of peace, will have no end. That is what so many of us here can testify that he is doing our own lives, as his rule works itself out into every part of it. How is it then that the first thing, the global increase happens? Well, it happens one personal increase of government at a time. Every area of all of our lives, every vocation is one that Jesus claims. He doesn't just claim a spiritual part of us and the rest of that is separate to us. No, he claims every part of it. Not so that everyone should become a monk or a missionary, but so that every vocation, every good thing might become his. It is good that there are doctors and shoemakers and factory owners and nurses, homemakers, even ministers. All of those things God has given us to do to glorify him, to increase the peace and government of Jesus. He's made us and he's placed us and is pleased with us when we advance things with excellence and effectiveness in his name. Well, as we finish, let me just kind of come to the very obvious objection to this. I'm talking about the increase of a rule which never ends. I'm talking about a global empire. Let's face it, I'm talking about something which looks very disturbingly like a world dictator. That's mad. How can I be saying it's a good thing that Jesus is the ruler of the whole world and that his government is increasing both in scope and in depth everywhere? How can I be saying that that's what Christmas is really all about instead of mince pies and log fires and singing? Well, I do encourage the mince pies and the log fires and the singing, and the paper hats and the turkey and all of this. But it's actually not what Christmas is about. We're celebrating in those ways because of this. Because God sent the things he'd promised hundreds and thousands of years before to bring a peace that will never end. Jesus is not a dictator in the way that we think of a dictator. He's more like the anti-dictator, the opposite of a dictator, one who set aside the authority he'd had as God from all eternity to be born in a feeding trough, to die on a Roman cross for crimes that he didn't commit, to save the people who did commit them. He did that to make peace in heaven, to make peace on earth. No dictator is like that. We have I suppose, understandable skepticism about authority, but we don't actually hate authority. We hate evil, corrupt, bad authority. And Isaiah 9 is promising the only authority that cannot be corrupted. Actually, something that, if its increase never ends, will drive out and overtake and clean out every corrupted power in the world. That's what's being promised here. I think the reason we find it hard to grasp is that we just cannot even conceive something quite so good as this. What if it's real? What if it's real that there is a rule which is so benevolent, so good, so full of peace, and it just gets bigger and better and bigger and better? Our minds can barely comprehend that. The very end of one of the books in C.S. Lewis's Narnia series, there's a lovely example of this when they come through. It's hard to explain how it happens, but in brief, they come to a new world, and the new world is one that just keeps getting better and better. And they race up through the hills of Narnia until it seems that they've come back to the same place again. But then they look up at the mountains, and the same mountains are there, and yet even bigger and even better. And they race up them again in rejoicing. And then it feels like they've come back to the same place again, and they look up at the mountains, and they're yet even greater, further up and further in is the call. Imagine a kingdom that's like that. Something that just keeps getting better and better and better. Well, you actually don't have to imagine it. That is what Christmas is about. The arrival of such a king and the inauguration of such a kingdom. If that's something that you think, well, that sounds too good to be true, but I would at least like it to be true, or at least I consider that it might be a nice thing if it were true, I would love to encourage you and invite you to come along to our life course, which is a course for investigating Christianity that we run about once a term. We're doing this on Sunday afternoons, beginning on the 11th of January. So there'll be a cup of tea, something to eat, very open time to ask any questions. And our first one is on satisfaction. What's the point of life? At 4 o'clock on Sunday, the 11th of January.